are familiar with the adrenal glands helping out in a fight or flight situation. But you also mentioned and just brought in the thymus gland and this cortisol thing. What, just to have a clear picture in my mind, what does the thymus gland do, and how is this cortisol related to what it's putting out?
The thymus gland is the center, really. It's the heart of the body's defense, its primary defense mechanism. There are basically two types of cells that are required to meet the challenge of an infection, be it a viral infection, a bacterial infection, or an invasion by some foreign tissue. These two types of cells are called B cells, derived from the bone marrow, and T cells, which are derived from the thymus gland. The thymus is responsible for programming these cells that recognize foreign material in the body. The B cells will produce antibodies, a special type of molecule, against the invading material, but only under the instruction received from T cells. Therefore, if T cells are exhausted and cannot identify foreign material, then you can see what sort of position you're placing your body in, because the front line of defense has been weakened. Therefore, the body can be taken over virtually at the will of any invading type of organism.
And the thymus produces the T cells.
The T cells, exactly.
And the T cells are there to identify foreign material, a virus or some tissue that's formed.
And not only identifying, but giving instructions to the B cells as to what to do about it.
Okay, and then the B cells
produce these antibodies and take care of it. Yes.
Kill or dispose somehow of the situation.
Exactly.
And are you suggesting that if we are constantly in a stressful situation, you use the example of the job and the boss that you feel you can't escape from, we're so worried about that, and we're so worried about maybe imaginary fears and other things, it all adds up, that when a real disease comes along and we need the body's defense system, it's exhausted, it's depleted.
Exactly. It's like the situation where there have been experiments to show that this actually happens. Nobody knows exactly how our emotional reactions become reflected in the body's ability or inability to defend itself against foreign material or invasion. And so let me tell you about a particular type of experiment that's been done. In Brown's University, and I think Brown's University is in Rhode Island, they did an experiment with college students, and they presented a situation that could be taken as stressful or not. And through psychological testing, they separated the students on the basis of those who regarded the situation as stressful as opposed to those who did not regard it as stressful. This is a total emotional reaction to the situation. They then took blood samples from each of the students, and they have techniques for separating out the white cells and then challenging those white cells to produce antibodies. In other words, testing the efficacy, the ability of those white cells to meet the challenge, which is an antibody response. Those students who considered the situation stressful, in other words, they felt, to pardon the pun, kind of castrated by the situation, ineffectual in the face of this situation, their white cells reflected this ineffectiveness in the sense that their white cells were not able to produce antibodies to the same degree as those students who did not regard it as a stressful situation, as a situation that they could not cope with. So stress, the whole business of stress having to do with a sense of not being able to cope, that sense of not being able to cope somehow gets translated into the cell's ability to cope or not to cope.
Were the students put through a stressful situation or just asked about a certain situation?
No, they were confronted with a given situation and they had to interpret it by their own emotional reactions. They had to interpret it as to whether or not it was stressful or not. See? And those who interpreted it as stressful, their cells were not as efficient in producing antibodies as those who interpreted the situation as not being stressful. Interpretation is a key word.
So what does this say about a person's ability to handle stresses in life? if you can handle stresses well, and they're not stressful to you, is it likely that your immune system is stronger
Oh, yes.
than a person
There's
who...
no question about that. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They're even finding that certain personality traits are associated more often with certain types of diseases than others. Cancer, for example. The personality profile of someone who is susceptible to cancer or does get cancer includes things like repressed emotions. Often they find that these are people who have suffered a great loss in their lives, be it a loved one or a particular type of relationship or what have you, and they have not been able to deal with it effectively. They're grieving inside. Cancer is being referred to as the griever's disease, the weeper's disease. They're grieving inside. They have not dealt with it effectively. And not having dealt with it effectively, this somehow manifests in the immune system, because the immune system would ordinarily fight off any quote-unquote foreign cell that arises in the body. Let me back up a bit. According to current theories, within the body, anybody's body, cells are always arising that are not in harmony, let us say, with that body. Again, the thymus is the gland that is concerned with this overall body harmony in terms of cells. And if you were to look at how white cells behave under the microscope, for example, they would sort of, I'm going to use the term, swim up to or sidle up to another cell, sort of check it out. They kind of go around it and then move on and move to the next cell and kind of go around it and move on. And there are particular type of cells called macrophages, and what they do is if they encounter a cell that is not in harmony, it's like they're going on checking out the vibes, as the saying goes. And if the vibes are not right, then they simply engulf this cell and destroy it.
And this is going on all the time?
Constantly. And so within the body, there is the potential for cells to arise that are not in harmony with the whole. It's like a rebel arising within the system. And what these cells do is keep checking to see who is in harmony and who is not. And if you're not in harmony, you're destroyed. Now, if the immune system is defective, then it is not capable of recognizing who is in harmony and who is not. And so the inharmonious cells will grow up in the system and take over, because all these cells have a sense of themselves. And they will fight off anything that is not in harmony with them. And so they will grow up in the body and take it over and eventually destroy the body. This is what cancer is. And so, again, we're talking about personality profiles. There are these attributes, these personality traits in cancer patients. In arthritic patients, for example, people who suffer from arthritis, these are people, according to these studies, who feel inadequate. And there are one or two ways in which they try to cover this sense of inadequacy. One is that they will take on more and more to prove to themselves and to everybody that they're capable of handling everything. In the meantime, within themselves, they're feeling more and more strapped. That's one way of coping with it. Another way of coping with it is avoiding responsibility. Oh, that's not important. This is not important. But internally, they still feel strapped. And what happens under those conditions is that the system kind of turns against itself. Things like arthritis are called autoimmune diseases. Diabetes is an autoimmune disease, where the self has turned against itself, where the immune system has turned against the body. It is not fighting foreign material now, it is fighting the body itself. In the case of diabetes, what is happening is that the immune system has produced antibodies to destroy those cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. And if the cells are destroyed, then you can't produce any insulin.
So a person who feels inadequate and keeps taking on more and more to prove themselves, they're continually stressing their system.
Exactly.
And on the other hand, the person who puts it all off and says, well, I'm not going to worry about it, they're paying lip service saying they're not going to worry about it, but subconsciously they feel it. And in both cases, it's breaking down the body.
Exactly.
What's interesting about this, Dr. Wilson, is it's almost a totally new way of looking at disease as compared to maybe 50 years ago, because you're stressing the importance, pardon the pun, of emotions and stress in the body's ability to deal with disease. And you've cited a few cases of diseases where the profile of the person likely to have that disease is either a person who's gone through an emotional disturbance or a person who's highly stressed. It's an interesting thing to explore. What about a spectacular disease in the papers today is AIDS? Is there any correlation between AIDS, for example, and stress?
Well, AIDS is definitely, it's referred to as acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and immune deficiency already tells you, it already gives you a clue. In AIDS patients, you remember we talked about the T cells.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are basically two types of T cells. There's a third type, but for our purposes, there are basically two types of T cells. One is called a helper T cell, and the other is called a suppressor T cell. Now, in normal circumstances, the ratio between the number of helper T cells and suppressor T cells is about 18 helper T cells to 10 suppressor T cells, about a ratio of approximately 2 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
In AIDS patients, the ratio is 1 to 1. Now, why is this important? It's important because it is the helper T cells that recognize foreign material and give instructions to the B cells to produce antibodies to destroy the foreign material. In this case, the AIDS virus.
The helper T cells are the scouts, and they say, look, we have an invader here.
Exactly.
You guys get ready and
go get them.
Okay.
The suppressor T cells can also recognize foreign material, but their job is to tell the system not to produce antibodies, so that between the helper and the suppressor, you control the level of antibodies that are going to be produced. So that if you change the ratio of helper to suppressor, you are changing the body's ability to produce antibodies. In the case of AIDS patients, not only is the number of helper T cells depressed, but the number of suppressor T cells is elevated. And so the system is being told, don't produce antibodies by the elevated number of suppressor T cells, and this weak voice from the reduced number of helper T cells saying, produce antibodies. And so the system is not producing antibodies to get rid of the AIDS virus. Now, it is not everyone who is exposed to the AIDS virus that gets AIDS. There are people who test positive for the AIDS virus, and these people are very healthy. Their immune system has recognized the AIDS virus as an invader. The helper T cells have said, we got an invader here, now go and produce antibodies, and the antibodies have been produced, and therefore they do not get AIDS. So that AIDS is not a matter of simply being exposed to the virus. It is not everyone who is exposed to the flu virus, for example, who gets the flu. The people who get the flu are the ones whose immune system is deficient, at least during the period of time that they have been exposed to the virus.
Okay, just clearing one last thing up on AIDS again. A normally healthy person, the virus comes in, the scouting cells say, look, there's a virus here, take care of it. Once it's taken care of, the body says, okay, turn off now.
Yes.
It's taken care of.
Yeah.
Don't produce any more antibodies to take care of it.
But the cells that have produced antibodies will remember. There is a memory that goes with it, you see. And these cells will remember, and each time, if in the future this AIDS or any other virus that we want to talk about shows up again, the cells will say, oh, I remember you, produce antibodies, and get rid of it.
Okay, so the persons who test positive, I don't know if that's the word.
Yes.
The people who have been tested and their
Test
blood
positive for AIDS.
Okay, they've been exposed to the AIDS virus,
Yes.
but they don't have it
AIDS.
because they have antibodies.
That's right.
Any other time they're introduced to that virus, the antibodies
The cells will remember, provided, of course, they haven't done anything in the interim to reduce their immune efficiency.
I see. And in the person who does have AIDS, what's wrong with that person is that instead of fighting off the virus, the body is telling those cells to shut down, not to.
Exactly, and then the virus gets into the cells of the body and reproduce themselves and keep decreasing the body's ability to fight and to fight and to fight. And finally,
it's totally overwhelmed.
Exactly. Totally overwhelmed, and the body dies.
Hmm.
That's why AIDS is so